Hi everyone, and welcome back to lecture. We're in week 13 and we're just about nearing the end of the semester. We're actually on our second to last week of new material, so it's approaching pretty quickly. Today we're going to be taking a little bit of time and focusing on decision making by trial court judges. So we're sort of back to this criminal aspect of the class. And for this week, you had a couple readings. You had chapter 13 of the CRIJ text and 2 online readings. The first was from Simon and CRIJ in 2011, and the other one was from Ferroli in 2009. So as always, those can be found in the weekly folder on the Blackboard class website. So jumping into the material for the week, there's a little bit to cover here. The textbook and your online readings are really discussing the different factors that go into how a judge makes a decision in a case. And there can be defendant factors, and really those are the things that the judges should be considering for the most part. For instance, a judge is always going to take into account what crime the defendant is accused of or was found guilty of in this case, the defendant's prior criminal record, what his or her demeanor is in court, employment history, history of stability, so whether or not the defendant is from the area in which he or she committed the crime, or whether or not they committed the crime while on vacation or if they're traveling, whether or not there are any sort of expressions of remorse, home stability, and a bunch of other factors, right? All of these things are going to sort of come into are going to be taken into account and will sort of weigh on the judge's decision in terms of sentencing, right? And these are all legal factors. These are things that the judges should be taking into account when they're making their ruling on how the defendant should be sentenced. But there are often extra legal variables that the judges take into account that they maybe not necessarily should be taking into account, but they still do. So it's not necessarily fair or impartial by any means, but just judges have been known in the past to take into account the defendant's race or the defendant's socioeconomic status, gender, even parental status has been taken into account and has been an influential factor on how the judge makes his or her decisions, right? So we know that race is this huge one, right? Black defendants typically are more often found guilty than white defendants, and they're also sentenced to longer prison sentences than white defendants. And whether or not this is a specifically unconscious bias and judges don't really know that they're doing this, or it's an outright show of racism against black defendants from some judges, it might be that way. It has been in the past. It still might be. Either way, the problem still exists, and we're seeing black defendants going to prison for a lot longer than their white counterparts. The other issue that we're seeing, and we talked a little bit about this already earlier in the semester, is sort of this extreme political pressure that a lot of judges face, especially if they are elected judges that have to go up for re-election at certain points in time. The other thing that has an influential factor on their political leanings is, of course, whoever has appointed them or whoever's in office at the time. And then the other thing is sort of the country dynamic at any certain time. So what I'm sort of referring to there is how overall is the country leaning in a more liberal sense, or is the country leaning towards a more conservative direction, and their rulings might sort of follow suit with how the country is leaning at the time. So one of the best examples that I think of this political leaning took place in the 1970s and early 1980s, so late 70s, early 80s, and we were seeing judges really heavily rely on the use of parole. And judges were sentencing defendants quite often to sentences that involve some sort of early release via parole. And even really it hit its peak in 1977, and I want to say somewhere around 75% of inmates were actually parole eligible and were able to serve the remainder of their prison sentences while living in the community. And at the same time, while this is happening, what you started seeing were just some really high-profile parolees who were getting out and were living in the community, and they were committing pretty violent offenses while they were living outside the prison. And specifically, I'm talking about a couple cases that came out of California, but I'm not going to get into the whole thing. But these parolees were committing these additional violent offenses while they were out on early release. And because of this, there was sort of this inherent political pressure, and the media kept covering these stories, and justices started feeling pressure to stop allowing repeat offenders to be released back into the community via parole. So they were starting to tighten the proverbial noose, if you want to call it that, and they were starting to sentence offenders to longer prison sentences without the possibility of parole. And then eventually what we saw was just this really stopgap altogether. And the federal government came out in 1984 and they said, we're going to abolish parole altogether. And then a bunch of states really just jumped on the bandwagon and said, well, if the federal government is doing it, we're going to do it too. And a lot of places have just abolished parole altogether. Some states still have it, and we'll talk about that in a second. But for the most part, the federal government and a lot of states have abolished parole, and by doing so have sort of taken the discretion away from judges altogether, and just really stop the practice. So when we're talking about judicial decision making, the most visible form of it is going to be seen at the Supreme Court level, whether that's the United States Supreme Court or that's a state level Supreme Court. You're going to see more insight, if you will, into what the justices were actually thinking. So anytime that there is a decision made at the state or United States Supreme Court level, there has to be a public record that's made available as to what the decision making was. So what was the vote from the judges, what was the issue that they were looking at, and then what was the rationale for why they decided the way they did. So I'm either in favor of this decision or I'm against it, and here are the reasons why. So we have all these public records from SCOTUS or from state Supreme Courts, and you can sort of go through and read what the justices were thinking and their legal arguments. But the same sort of public record doesn't necessarily exist for trial court level judges. And of course, you can always go, and if you want to pay money, you can get a transcript of the court proceedings, but you won't necessarily get that same level of insight because there's no discussion as to why I ruled a certain way, right? And certainly if there is a jury that is present for the case, you're not going to get the insight from them either. So yeah, you can purchase the trial transcripts from the trial court level, but those are very expensive, and you don't necessarily get to figure out why a case was ruled a certain way. So we aren't always privy to how trial court judges make their decisions, but certainly we hear about it if it's the wrong one, or if they release somebody too soon, or don't sentence somebody hard enough, or sentence somebody extremely hard. We hear about those things, and sometimes these decisions are, the rulings that judges make are based on the political cycle or the affiliation that they're associated with, right? And that's when it can get dangerous for the defendant, and we've sort of talked about this already, so I'm not going to go into it. But one of the best things that I sort of want to end this lecture on is this idea of determinate sentencing, right? And this is sort of what we talked about a minute ago with the abolishment of parole. So one of the best and also worst things that could have happened to the court system is this increased use of determinate sentencing. So at the federal level, at least, it was implemented in 1984 when parole was abolished at the federal level. And like I said before, the majority of states have just sort of followed suit and have jumped on this determinate sentencing bandwagon. And some states still have the use of parole, but it's very limited, and it's for low-level, non-violent offenders for the most part. But at the federal level, like we talked about, it was abolished, and only a handful of offenders still have the eligibility for parole because they were grandfathered in and they were sentenced before 1984. So those are the only individuals that still have the ability to be released on parole, but they're sort of few and far between at this point, just in general how people are sort of aging out. But because parole and essentially indeterminate sentencing were sort of thrown out, and we made this switch to determinate sentencing, what we also sort of threw out was the judge's ability to have any sort of discretion, right? And if we're really talking about the federal level, because that's where we saw the major parole plan sort of abolished, judges at the federal level, at the district court level, really are heavily reliant on these things called sentencing guidelines. And if you've never heard the term before, what sentencing guidelines basically do is it allows the court to plug into a formula the type of crime the defendant has committed, the criminal background, family history, all these things that we talked about before, and the formula shoots out a sentencing range. And for a long time, the judges at the district court level were so heavily reliant on these sentencing guidelines because they were mandatory that there was no real wiggle room. The formula would basically spit out a, 8 to 10 year prison sentence, and that was about as much wiggle room as you got. So judges had to sort of strictly adhere to the sentencing guidelines as they produced the sentence. But in 2005, with the Booker ruling, the Supreme Court basically said that the sentencing guidelines were no longer mandatory, but that they were highly recommended for justices to use. So now you have a little bit more discretion, but still they're not able to really waver from the sentence too much. So sentencing guidelines were sort of an additional attempt then to eliminate judicial discretion and create what is a pretty strict formula for how defendants should be sentenced. So like I said, if the defendant does this, this, and this, you get the formula, and really boom, out comes the sentence. And that's what the judge is supposed to be doing. So it sort of takes the job away from the judge in terms of sentencing, and basically the federal government then gives you a statutory sentence based on what they feel is appropriate. So the judge's role in sentencing is sort of obsolete in that sense. So really, if we're thinking about this practice was really meant as a way to sort of eliminate potential biases, in a sense. But in reality, the sentencing structure that the federal government has come up with these sentencing guidelines has really caused more harm than good at this point, and essentially has, by eliminating parole, has overpacked our prison system to the absolute extreme. And it's sort of, that's sort of a different conversation for a different day, and is more geared towards the corrections class, so we'll leave it there. But at any rate, at this point, I'm going to let you get on with the ratings and with the different video lectures for the week, and let me know if there's anything that you need to discuss with me, as always, and I look forward to the submissions that you have for me this week. So one more week of new material, and then your final papers are due. So I will see you guys next week for our final lecture. Thanks. Bye.